Hi, this is Kathy Atkinson. I am the owner of Mind, Body, and Soul, and today we are here for a mini class, an online mini class on the cough, colds, sneezing, flus, those types of things that are happening right now. In fact, my husband came home with something just last week, and I had a client today that I was working with who had some things too, and that kind of prompted me to do this mini class on the things that we do when we have those types of symptoms. I am sure that there's going to be a lot of questions, and since I don't take a lot of time to answer questions, I just don't have time to answer questions on these mini classes because I really try to keep them to about somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. If you have questions, please write them in the comments of this Facebook Live post. And then tomorrow I am going to do a Q&A on my website that will have the answers to all your questions. It will have links to the products that we're going to be talking about, to the things that I'll be sharing with you. It'll have recipes for the things that I'll be sharing with you as well. So feel free to list those questions there, and hopefully I'll be able to answer all the questions that you have as well. So the first thing that I wanted to share with you a little bit is just what do I do to build a strong immune system, and why is it important to have a strong immune system? And then we'll talk a little bit about the things that my family does when we have a cold. And then after that, because we are bio individuals, because things that work for me may not work for you all the time, I'm going to give you some suggestions on some other things that you might find helpful too. So, I don't know that I could stress enough the importance of an immune system, the importance of a strong immune system, that is. And, in the 1880s, the late 1880s, Louis Pasteur came out and said that it was germs that caused disease. And there was a group of new professionals that were coming out at that time, some of them with only about a month's worth of training, and they were quick. They were anxious to find a way to distinguish themselves from the traditional medical profession of the day, which was people who were, they're naturopaths, they were herbalists, they were using herbs. And they really wanted to distinguish themselves from the traditional doctors. And so they were quick to grab onto this theory of germs creating the problem. And they ran with that, and they called themselves allopathic doctors. But what was interesting is about a year later, Louis Pasteur came back and said, whoops, I was wrong. Due to additional research, germs are not the primary cause of disease, they're the secondary cause of disease. And the primary cause is the terrain, the condition of the body, and its buildup of toxins and how healthy the body is. And so building a strong immune system really is about having a healthy body and eliminating toxins. And so one of the things that is important for that is a healthy digestive system. And I know that the last 3 mini classes that I've done have been on things that you can do to build a healthy immune system, or excuse me, a healthy digestive system. But it's just super important. In fact, I'm going to be doing one more mini class later on this month on it's a protocol that I developed called the Perfect Trifecta for Intestinal Health. And I'm going to be sharing that with you later on this month. But the reason it's so important is because 70% of the cells that make up your immune system are actually located in the gut walls. And so having a healthy gut really is important to having a healthy immune system. And so that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But some things that you can do now to support the immune system. One of the things that I do is morning and night, I put an essential oil on my feet to support immune system health. Now, the one that I happen to use is Deliverance. There are lots of different kinds, depending on the brand of oils that you happen to have an allegiance to, or I use several different brands. I probably got 5 or 6 different companies, maybe even more, that I've purchased oils from that I use regularly. But I use Deliverance on my feet morning and night. That's an essential oil that's designed specifically to support the immune system. I also, when I brush my teeth, I put a couple of drops I aim for one. Sometimes I end up having two. A couple of drops of another essential oil blend called Spicy. It's very similar to Deliverance in that it's designed specifically to support the immune system, but it tastes better than Deliverance, and so I use that on my toothbrush every time I brush my teeth. Some other things that you can do to support the immune system would be things like dry body brushing, deep breathing. The lungs are actually the pump for the lymphatic system, and so doing some deep breathing every day supports that as well. And then, of course, supporting your gut health. So what happens when somebody in my family comes home and they have a cold, or they feel like they're coming down with the cold? Maybe they have some sneezing, maybe they have some coughing, maybe they have, just feeling kind of achy, maybe they've got a fever, those types of symptoms. Well, that actually happened to my husband last week. He came home and he was sneezing and he had some sinus congestion and he was coughing a little bit and he just didn't quite feel right. And so I said, honey, you should probably do the things that I'm going to tell you about today. And he was like, oh, I know, I really should. But he didn't. And so the next day, he comes home from work and he still has the sinus congestion and he has coughing and he's feeling kind of yucky. And so this time I made it for him. I actually handed him, here you go, honey, you need to take this. Here you go, honey, you need to do this. And he did. And he did it that whole day. And then the next day he was like, I actually feel kind of better. But he wanted to continue it a second day just because there was a little bit of residual symptoms. And so he continued it the next day, went to work. He comes home the day after that and he says, honey, it's really interesting. I feel fine. I mean, I had the symptoms for a couple of days. I feel fine now. But the guys at work, they've had this like 2 and 3 weeks. This is really cool. And I'm like, yep, it really is, honey. And so, today I had a client come in and she had some of those same symptoms. And so she said, what do I do? And so I shared with her the things I'm going to share with you today. And then we'll talk, after I share those things with you, we'll talk a little bit about bioindividuality. So when I feel like I'm starting to come down with something, I mentioned that I use Deliverance on my feet morning and night when I get up in the morning and before I go to bed at night. Well, when I feel like I'm starting to come down with something, I start using my Deliverance essential oil every 4 hours. Then, depending on my symptoms, if I've got a cough with some chest congestion, I'm going to start using an essential oil called Aspire. Aspire is really good for lungs and chest congestion. If I have sinuses and runny nose and sneezing, I'm going to use an essential oil blend called Breezy. Breezy is very good for upper respiratory problems. I'm also going to start taking some herbal tinctures. Now, herbal tinctures are herbal medicine. And when you take herbs, of course, are very nourishing. They're nourishing. They have a lot of medicinal compounds as well. But when you take the herbs and you put them in water, you're going to pull a lot of the nutritive properties out. You're going to pull a lot of the nutrients out of the herbs, okay? And the longer you let it sit, the more nutrients you're going to pull out. So if you want a tea, most people will let it steep for about 15 minutes, and that's going to give you some benefits. But when I do an herbal infusion, I'm going to let it sit for at least 4 hours. And typically, I'll let it sit overnight, okay? But when you are making a tincture, tinctures are soaked. Instead of soaking the herbs in water, you're going to soak the herbs in some either alcohol or glycerin. Now, alcohol is not pure alcohol. It's alcohol and water. Even I think 90 proof is 50% of one and 40% of the other. I don't remember which is which, but when you're soaking the herbs in alcohol, you're pulling out the nutrition from the herbs, but the alcohol actually pulls out the alkaloids, which is the herbal medicine. So you're pulling out the medicinal components as well as the nutritional components, and your body needs both. So when I'm using a tincture, I know that to me, that's my herbal medicine. Essential oils can be used that way too, but I typically find that the tinctures not that they work better, but they work differently. And so I use them both. I'll use the oils to kind of an all day kind of supportive, as a supportive role, and then I'll get in there and I'll really hit it hard with my herbal tinctures as well. So the tinctures that I use when I'm feeling sick or when my husband is feeling sick, we use two primarily. We'll use one that's called, hey Mary Beth, we'll use one that's called IF, which stands for infection fighter, and that one is really good for any kind of infection, whether you've got an earache or whether you've got a sore throat, anything like that. Infection fighter is the tincture that I'm going to use. And then I use it in connection with one called LT, lymph tonic, because you really want to get the lymph moving. Of course, you know that the lymph is like the garbage picker upper for the body. Okay, so I'm going to use IF and LT tinctures along with my essential oils. Now, the way that I do that, I kind of stagger it, because you want to use your oils every 4 hours, but you also want to use your tinctures every 4 hours. So what I'll do is I'll put my oils on my feet and my chest. Now, if I've got both, and I mentioned that I use Aspire if I've got lung congestion or chest congestion, and I'll use Breezy if I've got, sinus congestion. If I have both, then I'll use both. I'll just put maybe one on my chest and one on my back, and then 4 hours later when I put them on, I'll rotate that. So if I put Aspire on my chest and Breezy on my back, 4 hours later I'll put Breezy on my chest and Aspire on my back. And then of course I've got the Deliverance on my feet. So I'll put that on, and I'll make a note to what time I put it on so that 4 hours later I can put it on again. So I've got my oils on. Now 2 hours later, I'm going to take my tinctures. I'm going to take my IF tincture and my LT tincture, and all I do is take about a dropper full, and I'll usually muscle test to see if I need more, but a dropper full is about 30 drops, and that's a good place to start for an adult. And so I'll put a dropper full of IF and a dropper full of LT in a glass of water. I put it in the same glass of water, and I'll drink that. So I've put my oils on. 2 hours later, I'm going to take my tinctures. 2 hours later, I'm going to put my oils on again. So it's been 4 hours since I put my oils on, but it's been 2 hours since I've taken my tinctures. And then 2 hours later, I'll do my tinctures again. So I'm doing oils every 4 hours, tinctures every 4 hours. Hi, Jill. But I'm staggering them so that every 2 hours I'm doing something. Okay. Now, in the meantime, I've got my oils on. I've taken my tinctures. The other thing that I do is make a batch of something that I call the Brew. The Brew is really good for anything where there's infection, anything. It's just a real good tonic, and it really helps fight. And now generally when I make the Brew, the instructions say to drink it over 2 days. I don't. I drink when I'm getting a cold or when I'm feeling sick, I drink that batch of Brew all in 1 day. I'm really going to hit it hard. Okay, so I've got the oils on my feet, I've got the oils on my chest, I've taken my tinctures, and now I'm drinking the Brew, and I'm drinking it over the course of the whole day. And of course, I want to rest as well, because the body heals when it's in a parasympathetic state. Parasympathetic state is kind of known as rest and digest and revive and thrive. And the sympathetic state is that stress state. Okay, it's fight or flight. And when your body is in stress mode, when it's in fight or flight mode, it's not going to stop and heal itself. So in order to heal, you need to rest. And that's why you've heard many times, I'm sure, that when you're sick, that your body needs to rest. So I'll rest. But my body also needs nutrition. It also needs nutrients to help. And of course, it's getting some of those nutrients from the oils. And yes, it's getting some of those nutrients from the herbs. But what I take in addition to the herbs and the oils and my Brew is I heat up some bone broth. Bone broth is so nourishing. I can't even tell you how important it is to have good bone broth. And when I say good bone broth, what I mean is that the bones, first of all, it's going to be homemade. I don't know of any place that you can get good bone broth from a can or even a box. So you're going to take some bones from some pasture-raised animals. So animals who have been grown or raised, not grown, but raised on pasture. they've been raised on grass. They've not been raised in confinement. So you're going to find some either chickens or some chicken bones or some, that's why chicken soup, right? Okay, so chicken bones or beef bones, either one, and you're going to make yourself a good batch of broth. If you want to throw some onions in there, you can. If you want to throw some garlic in there, you can. But you make a batch of bone broth. And we actually make ours when we harvest our cow. And so I have all this bone broth that I already have ready to go. And so I just take a can off the shelf or a jar off the shelf and heat it up. And I start sipping the bone broth as well because I need that nourishment. So what usually happens is I do it and the next day everything is gone. And as far as everything, I mean all the symptoms are gone. And I might maybe have a few residual ones, so I might continue it a second day. But there was a time once when I came home from church and started making lunch for my family. And within about 2 o'clock, I went from being in a 15-minute time span, I went from feeling totally fine to being flat on my back. I felt horrible. And so that's what I did. I got my oils out, I got my tinctures out, I got my bone broth out, I got my brew made, and I laid on the sofa. And I would sleep. And every time I woke up, I would have some of my brew, I would have some of my bone broth, and I would go back to sleep. And when I woke back up again, I would, it might have been time for my oils. I might, put my oils on again. But I made sure I was getting my oils every 4 hours, my tinctures every 4 hours. And again, I was staggering them so that every 2 hours I was doing something. And then I was drinking my bone broth and I was drinking my brew. And I woke up the next day and I was fine, nothing. And seriously, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was laid out on the sofa. And that happened within a 15-minute time span because I came home from church and I was fine. And then, like I said, 2 o'clock, I was out. And so I started doing exactly what I just shared with you. And the next day, the symptoms were all gone. So we talked a little bit earlier, I mentioned bioindividuality. We are all individuals. And so even though this is something that has worked for lots of people, today I had a client come in and she was having some of those same symptoms that my husband had earlier last week or late last week. And I shared with her just the same things that I shared with you. And she's, okay, great, I'm gonna do this when I get home. But when I tested what she needed for the zone, the oil that she needed was Life Force. Now, Life Force is also one that's really great for the immune system. It's also great for the adrenal glands. And so when you're kind of run down, using that Life Force can kind of help boost you up. And it's good for fevers as well. She also tested for a homeopathic. She tested for a cell salt, a homeopathic cell salt. She tested for number 5, which is Calimur. And when we looked it up to see what the properties were, it was interesting because it says for medium fever, mucus, and coughs. And so that's what she needed. So I'm going to share with you a couple of other things that you can do in case the things I gave you earlier don't completely get rid of everything that you've got going on. Now, if it was me, I would start with the things I just talked about because I've seen it over and over again help people. So I would start with that. And then if that second day you still got some symptoms, maybe add in some of these other things that we're going to talk about. I just mentioned Life Force, which is really good for the immune system, for a fever, for the adrenal glands, but there's also 2 other ones, Stephanie and Mariah, that are really good for lungs. So if you've got some lung congestion, and in fact, Stephanie was made to specifically target those bacteria that might be involved in pneumonia. So it really helps fight those the pneumonia bacteria. But Mariah is also very good for lungs, as is Stephanie, and Mariah is good for symptoms of the flu. Now, there's another one, Thermacare, that is good for flu symptoms, but Thermacare was specifically designed to support fever. Now, fever is one of the responses, your immune system responses, and so when your body is fighting something, you are going to have more than likely a fever, at least on some level. And so I know that people kind of sometimes will freak out about, oh no, my child has a fever or I have a fever. Well, that just means that the immune system is working, it's doing what it's supposed to do. And as long as the fever doesn't get over like 102, I guess is about the safe range. But as long as it doesn't get more or higher than that, it's really the body doing what it's supposed to do. And so even though we try to suppress the fever by taking medication, I don't. In fact, I rarely take medication. I'll use my oils, I'll use my herbs, I'll use the brew. But if you're really concerned, Thermacare might be one that you would want to use to support a fever. Now there's some other ones as well, some other tinctures. Super C is a really good herbal tincture that's kind of like the first response. It might even be one that you use to help build, but it's really one that, you know, that first little, okay, I got a little scratch in the back of my throat, so maybe I'm going to use some Super C. It's also really good for lymph drainage. There's another one called WC, which is good for coughs. There's PL, which stands for lungs. So it's kind of a milder version of lung congestion, and it should be used with some kind of infection fighting one. IB is immune builder, and that's one for building the immune system. We talked about that earlier when I mentioned that some things that I do daily, which is the deliverance on my feet morning and night, but you know, might want to take IB or immune builder as well. FC is one for flu combination. RC is a red clover combination, and that's a really good infection fighter as well. And then RCL is the red clover combination with an added lomatium, and that's effective for really bad viral infections and things like that. Now, I mentioned also a homeopathic that my client tested for today, which was number 5, Cali Myrrh, which was for medium fevers, mucus, and coughs. There's another homeopathic remedy, number 4, Ferrum Phos, which is for low fevers that you can use at the first sign of a cold or the flu. It's for a head cold or headaches or earaches. So there are other natural remedies out there that you can use in addition to essential oils. We've got the herbal tinctures and, you know, the homeopathic remedies. And of course, nutrition. I can't stress enough the importance of good nutrition, eliminating sugar, and healing the gut. So I really hope that this has been helpful. I know it's been kind of a crash course. I just want to review real quickly again the things that I do, which are the essential oils, deliverance on my feet morning and night. But when I've got a cold, when I feel like I'm coming up with something or coming down with something, I use deliverance on my feet every 4 hours. My tinctures that I use are IF and LT, and I use those every 4 hours. And again, I stagger them. So I'll put my oils on. 2 hours later, I'll use my tinctures. 2 hours later, I'll put on my oils again. 2 hours later, I'm using my tinctures again. So even though I'm doing them every 4 hours, I'm staggering. So I'm doing something every 2 hours. Then I'll make a batch of the brew, and I'll drink that all in one day. The next day, if I feel like I still have some of those symptoms, I'm going to make another batch of the brew, and I'm going to do it again. And then I'll make a batch of bone broth if I don't already have some bone broth on hand. Good, healthy bone broth made from pastured animals that have been raised on pasture. And I'll drink that to nourish my body. Even when, I know sometimes when you're sick, you don't really feel like eating. Your body needs that nourishment. If you have questions, and I'm sure that there's going to be a ton of questions, please ask them on this feed here. And then tomorrow there's going to be a Q&A on my website. My website is Mind, Body, and Soul Online, and soul is SOLE, online.com. There'll be a Q&A. I'll give links to all the oils and all the tinctures that I talked about today. I'll give the recipe for the brew. I'll give you a link to the recipe. I think I've got a recipe on my website for bone broth already, and so I'll share the link for that. I'll answer as many of your questions as I can and hopefully get them all answered for you. And hopefully, you know, if something does hit your family and you start to come down with something, you can try some of these things that I've shared with you today, and you'll be gone it'll be gone from you in 24 hours as well. You don't have to spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks like the guys at my husband's work having these horrible symptoms. Thank you again for joining me. I hope this was informative for you. Later on this week, this month, remember I mentioned that I'll have another online mini class on a protocol that I called the Perfect Trifecta for Intestinal Health, and hopefully you can join me on that, and I'll get the details out for that soon. But thank you very much. I appreciate you guys for joining me. Thanks, Mary Beth. Thanks, Jill, for chiming in and saying hi. I love you guys both, and I will talk to everyone later. Thanks. Bye-bye.